How's it going, everybody? I'm Alfred. Welcome to One Piece of Insight, where we use analysis to help you achieve your TCG collecting goals. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the data on each of the most popular card graders to understand how exclusive each graded card is. Make sure you stay tuned to the end of the video to find out which slabs may be undervalued compared to their peers. So the question I sought to answer with this analysis is, how exclusive is the card you're buying when you pay a premium for a slab, right? If raw price is X and people are paying 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times that, how exclusive and how sort of unique is that card compared to what you could be buying if you just bought a raw card and if you graded yourself? So in order to do that, I went through each of the four largest or four major card graders that are used for TCGs. So we have PSA, we have Beckett, we have CGC, and we have TAG. I took 20 cards that are super popular and tried to get a representative sample of both mangas, SPs, some cheaper cards as well, to understand what the gem rates are for each of those, as well as what the rates are for some of their lower grading categories, to understand approximately where in the distribution of all cards produced those cards will actually fall. Then I put those into essentially a really basic graphic to understand when you're buying a PSA 10, how does that stack up against a BGS 10 or a CGC 10 Pristine or a TAG 10 Gem Mint, for example. And then finally, I looked at the prices that the cards are going for in those different grades to see if we could understand where people are maybe overvaluing certain grades and undervaluing other grades. So why don't we go ahead and jump right into the data. So here you can see the raw data that I collected. So the 20 cards that I looked at were the Luffy Gear 5 manga, the Shonen Jump magazine promo, the 20th anniversary one, the OP11 Luffy manga, the first anniversary Luffy, that's for the collection with the Japanese woodblock type print, the OP01 Luffy Leader, this is the post-errata, not the pre-errata, the Dodgers Luffy, the OP01 Luffy Alt, the OP09 Nami SP, the OP07 Nami SP, the OP03 Nami Leader, the Nami Illustration Box, the Treasure Rare Nami, the OP09 Boa SP, the OP04 Boa SP, the Boa PSA promo, the Luffy Serialized to 1000, the OP09 Wanted Luffy poster, the OP09 Zoro Juru, and the Gear 2 event manga. I wanted to try to get sort of a wide and representative sample of different types of cards. Now, looking first at the PSA pop, a couple things that really stand out here is how many of these Shonen Jump prints there are. Even though it's a relatively new card, there are already almost 5,000 PSA 10s, even though they're still going for like a decent amount of money. And then what really stands out is this Dodger Luffy. Even though it's almost $1,000 raw and people are paying a large premium for PSA 10s, there are significantly more of those than there are of any other card that I looked at. Which I think is really interesting. All right, so first, starting with PSA, we took the gem rate for each of these individual cards, which range from about 95% at the high for the Shonen Jump and 71% at the low for the first anniversary Luffy. And we averaged those to get an average gem rate of 89% for PSA 10s. Then we look at PSA 9s, 9% of all cards that are submitted in One Piece come back as PSA 9s, and then 3% come back less than PSA 9s. All right, now looking over at BGS. For black labels, we have an average rate of 4.94%. So about 5% of all cards submitted to BGS that are One Piece cards come out as a black label. So that's pretty hard to get. In a BGS 10, we have 35.01%. So about 40% of all cards submitted to BGS come back as either a pristine 10 or a black label. Then the next category, we have 9.5. We have 53% are 9.5s, and then 7.16% are less than 9.5. So once we get into CGC, you can see here that 50.76% of CGC submissions come back a pristine 10. So that's lower than the BGS 10, but also still higher than PSA 10. 30.67% come out a CGC 10, and then 18.56% come out a little bit lower, lower than the CGC 10. Now for TAG, I did things a little bit differently because on the TAG website, you can actually go through and look at their total population report of all their cards graded of certain types. And so rather than going through on an individual card basis, I just looked at their total cards and then I ran the numbers for that. And so when we get into the findings, we can see here for TAG, TAG has a 10 pristine, which actually is quite similar in terms of rarity or prestige to a BGS Black Label. Now, obviously, they don't command the same value in the market because most people don't even know that TAG has a pristine, in my experience. And TAG obviously doesn't have the same reputation that Beckett does. But I thought it was really interesting that TAG pristines are 5.3% of all submissions, which is only slightly higher than Beckett Black Labels. Below that, we have TAG 10s, which are 74.2%, TAG 9s, 17.2%, and below TAG 9 was 3.4%. Okay, so what does this all mean? So if you look at this graphic here, where it says PSA, BGS, TAG, and CGC, I broke this up into deciles to basically say, if you're breaking the population of graded cards down into deciles, so every 10%, what grade would you expect to get? The idea being that you can see how those stack up against each other, right? So if your card is a BGS Black Label, you would expect it to also be a PSA 10 and a TAG pristine and a CGC pristine. But if your card is a PSA 10, it could be a Beckett Black Label, or it could be a BGS 9.5, or it could be a TAG 9. Because the distribution of those cards for PSA is far wider than it is for a lot of these other graders. So this is the most important thing on this page right here, I think, where we have essentially this graphic that identifies by tiers how we should be valuing these cards just in terms of prestige, right? In terms of how rare they are relative to a random submission. So the way to think about this is if you submitted 100 cards, how many of these cards that you get back would actually fall into the given category? And so I looked at this to say that if you would get fewer cards back in that grade, if you submitted it to this grader, that makes it more exclusive than a grader where if you submitted the same number of cards, you would get more cards back in that grade. And so I used that to rank the different graders and their tiers. So at the top here, we have, of course, the BGS Black Label, which any card that grades a BGS Black Label is in the top 5% of all submissions to BGS. Next, we have the TAG 10 Pristine, which is very close within the top 6% of all submissions to TAG. Below that, we have BGS 10 Pristine. This ranges, we know it's not the top 5%, because if it was the top 5%, it would have been a Black Label, but it goes up until the top 40%. So if you are buying a BGS 10 Pristine, you're getting between sort of like the top 6 best cards out of 100 and the 40th best card out of 100. CGC Pristine 10 falls below that with the top 51%. So if you get a CGC Pristine 10, it could be equivalent to a Black Label in quality, or it could be below a BGS 10. So it has a much wider range there. Now, it's important to note as we're thinking about this, that whenever you're buying a card that's graded, you should be looking at the card quality, not just the number, because as we can see here, there is a very wide range of cards that can receive very similar grades. So if you really care about card quality, no matter what you buy, you should always pay attention to try to understand whether you're getting a very high end of the range of the cards that are graded that grade, or if you're getting a lower end of the grade. Next, below CGC, we have TAG 10 with top 6% to top 80%. So again, once we get into the regular 10 ranges, more than half the cards that you're going to get are going to come back as a 10. So as we think about a premium, how much of a premium we're paying against raw, we should assume that the cards that are being sent off to graders are of a higher quality than the ones that are not getting sent off to graders. So it's not an exact, 50%, but most of the cards that are going to card graders are coming back as a 10. So that really should put some type of premium on the cards that are above that. So the BGS 10, the TAG 10 Pristine, and the BGS Black Label, and to a lesser extent, perhaps, the CGC Pristine 10. Next, below that, we have CGC 10s, which are 51% to 82%. And then below that, we have PSA. So the challenge with PSA, from my perspective, in terms of evaluating the card, is that if almost 90% of all PSA cards, all one-piece cards submitted to PSA, come back as a 10, you could be getting a black label quality card, or you could be getting a BGS 9.5 quality card or a TAG 9 quality card. And so it's such a wide range that for me, it's very difficult to evaluate what you're actually getting when you're buying that label. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind when you're deciding where you want to actually make your investments or where you want to build your collection. Next, we have BGS 9.5. And so what's interesting here is that about half the time, a BGS 9.5 and a PSA 10 are going to be the same quality card. 3% of the time, a BGS 9.5 will be worse than a PSA 10, and 40% of the time, a PSA 10 will be better than a BGS 9.5. So while we do hear people say that BGS 9.5 is equivalent to PSA 10, that is true in the sense that they're both regarded as gem mints, but PSA has a more positive skew to their distribution than BGS does. So in general, I think it's fair to say that PSA 10s should cost more than BGS 9.5s, even though it hurts me to say that as I have a lot of BGS 9.5s. Below that, we have TAG 9s from 81% to 97%, PSA 9s from 89% to 97%, and then you have CGC less than 10, BGS less than 9.5, TAG less than 9, and PSA less than 9. So what does this mean in terms of tiers of how we think about this? And what I really want to talk about is how this relates to raw, right? So when should we be buying raw and submitting ourselves versus when should we be paying a premium for a card that's already been graded? So in our tier 1 here, we have BGS Black Label as sort of the top, and then TAG Pristine 10, similar in terms of exclusivity. Obviously, they don't necessarily command the same price on the market, which I think is interesting. And I think if you really care about card quality less than you care about sort of prestige, TAG 10 Pristine is somewhere that you might look to try to find a good value. Tier 2, I would say BGS 10 is sort of in its own tier. It's not nearly as strong as the Black Label or the TAG 10 Pristine, but there's sort of nothing that's particularly close to it in terms of its exclusivity. Next, we have the CGC 10 Pristine. And then in our tier 4, I would put TAG 10s, CGCs, and PSA 10s together as roughly equivalent cards. Now, again, if you're looking at the individual card and it appears to be a better quality, that's a different story. But in terms of sort of the lowest quality card that you might get within that grade, those are relatively equivalent. Then we have BGS 9.5. The key thing here for me, I think I want you to take away from this, is that a raw card I would evaluate as being slightly below a BGS 9.5. And that's mostly because of the grading cost. Without knowing sort of how many cards don't get sent into grading because they are lower quality, it's really difficult to evaluate sort of how exclusive these cards actually are. But based on the submission rates, I think that if you're looking anything below a BGS 9.5, you are probably better off buying raw and submitting it yourself. I think in most cases, though, unless you're talking about a Black Label, a TAG Pristine, or a BGS 10, you're probably better off just cherry picking a good raw card and submitting it in yourself. Okay, so how does this translate in terms of prices? So here I've bolded sort of where I see outliers of these individual prices. So I took 10 of the 20 cards that I looked at, and I tried to find the most recent sales in each of those cards. I was not able to find sort of consistency across all of them because a lot of them don't sell frequently enough. I will also say this is outdated by a couple days, so please don't use this as an indication of what these are worth. This is really just intended to facilitate a conversation around what things should possibly cost. So there's a couple outliers here I want to point out. So if we look at this 09 NAMI SP, a raw price of $800, we had a best offer accepted of around $1,250 in a PSA 9. A PSA 9 should not cost more than a raw card. If you buy a raw card and you submit it to any one of the graders, most of the time, and in the case of PSA, 90% of the time, you're going to get a better grade back than a PSA 9. And so paying a premium for a graded card that is below what you would expect to get if you submit it doesn't make a ton of sense. And this is something that we see across several of the PSA cards. So the OP07 NAMI, for example, we had a PSA 8 sell for $400 versus $360 raw. That is a bottom 3% submission of all cards submitted to PSA. And so why you would pay a premium over raw for that is pretty surprising to me. Now, obviously, there is a burden to submitting cards. PSA in particular is taking an incredibly long time to get cards back. You have to pay for it. I do understand the premium for why you wouldn't want to necessarily do that yourself. But I think if you are able to grade, in cases like that, you are definitely better off submitting it, or honestly, even just buying the raw card. A couple other things I wanted to point out here is that if you look at the PSA 10 prices relative to their peers, they tend to be consistently overvalued. So for the Gear 5 manga, now these prices have jumped quite a bit since I pulled this data a few days ago, but we had a PSA 10 sale at $10,000 and a BGS 10 sale at $9,500. Now, a massive caveat to all this data is that because these sales are not super frequent, and because the market has been absolutely insane, comparing sales from one day to another can be a huge difference in price. So it's not necessarily an indication of a trend. They're just individual data points. So please keep that in mind. But we have seen examples across different cards where PSA 10s are selling for more than BGS 10s. From a scarcity perspective, from a prestige perspective, there is no reason why that should happen. A BGS 10 is much more difficult to get than a PSA 10. There's also reason to believe that the numbers that I provided are actually skewed a little bit against BGS because, and I've talked to a lot of collectors, if they have a really high quality card, they tend to send them to BGS out of hopes to get a black label. If they have a card that they know isn't going to get a black label, they're more inclined to send it to PSA because that's how they maximize their value. And so it is certainly possible that the cards being sent to BGS are on average of better quality than those being sent to PSA. And so that's the type of thing to keep in mind when we're using this data, to recognize that it's fundamentally limited in what it tells us about something. A couple other things to point out here is obviously there's a tremendous premium for black labels that can run anywhere from 4x to here we have a 6x premium. That, to me, in some sense, if you care about the exclusivity of the black label, is justified because you would, on average, have to submit about 20 cards in order to get a black label, as opposed to, a PSA 10 where 9 out of 10 cards you submit are going to come back. In our next video, actually, we plan to go through each one of these grades and try to come up with a rule of thumb for how much more we should be paying for each grade based on a level of scarcity. So if you're interested in that type of content, please like and subscribe. This is our first video, but we hope to be doing more content like this. So if there's anything you'd like to see in the future, please drop a comment. I'm happy to chat. If you have any questions, always happy to respond. One last thing that I wanted to point out here from this chart is the TAG 10 Pristine. TAG 10 Pristine prices in general seem to be significantly lower than their black label equivalent. A lot of people don't even know that TAG has a Pristine grade, and so I was very surprised that the grading rate of the TAG 10 Pristine was 5.3% of submissions, which is very similar to the black label's 4.74%. And yet, TAG 10 Pristines can typically be had for, 25%, a third of the price of a black label. They typically command more of a premium than like a PSA 10, maybe are similar to a BGS 10, but definitely less than a BGS black label. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people would prefer a BGS over a TAG Pristine. Maybe you question how effective and accurate the AI grading is. Maybe you question how serious the market for buying TAG cards are. But if you are interested in arbitrage, or if you're just a collector and you really care about having the highest quality, most exclusive cards at an affordable price point or a more affordable price point, nothing is affordable right now. That may be an opportunity for you to get a card that would otherwise be inaccessible in a black label. And so that's something to keep in mind. The last thing I want to say before we close out the video is In this analysis, I was looking at exclusivity, right? So how common are the grades for each of the graders based on the number of submissions that they get? That is one way to look at what we should be paying for cards. But there are, of course, other considerations that matter a lot. What does the card command at market in different slabs? What type of slabs do you already have in your collection that you may want to complete? What slabs do you prefer? All of these things do matter. All of these things do play into price. But I wanted to do this analysis to show that I think that people, particularly those who are coming over from Pokemon and maybe aren't familiar with the card quality in One Piece, are looking at PSA 10s as if they are a premium product in the way that they are for Pokemon, where maybe you have a 25 to 40% gem rate across a lot of different cards. Whereas here, they are barely better in terms of card exclusivity than a raw card. And so I think as people get more information about One Piece as opposed to other card games that perhaps they've been involved with in the past, we could see some of that PSA premium come down. And so I think it's both an opportunity to buy non-PSA cards while they may be relatively undervalued compared to PSA, but I also think it's a warning to those who are buying PSA cards, these really inflated premiums, that you could be overpaying and you might want to be careful with what you're buying if your intent is to sell in the future. And so with that, thank you for watching. I hope you tune in next time as we continue to bring you more analysis in the future to help improve your journey for collecting TCGs. Thanks so much and have a great day.